There seems to be a new big dog on the block in the Big Sky Conference. A lot of times we're talking about the Eastern Washington Eagles and also the Montana Grizzlies, but here's why you have to start to talk about the Idaho State Bengals as we take a look at the upcoming schedule this week in the Big Sky Conference.
Idaho makes the trip to Bozeman to take on Montana State. Portland State will host the 0-6 Bears of Northern Colorado. Sacramento State takes the trip to Cedar City to take on the Thunderbirds. Number 22 Montana takes the trip to former Big Sky foe North Dakota. The number 14 Aggies of UC Davis will have their hands full as the Idaho State Bengals come to town. And in the Big Sky Game of the Week, we see number 4 Eastern Washington Eagles travel down to Ogden, Utah to take on the number 13 Weber State Wildcats. Looking at the standings, number 4 Eastern Washington sits atop the Big Sky with a 3-0 in-conference record, followed by Idaho State and number 14 UC Davis, both 2-0 in conference. Number 22 Montana and Northern Arizona, 2-1. Number 13 Weber State is 1-1, as well as Montana State. Idaho, Cal Poly, and Portland State sit at 1-2 in conference, while Sacramento State, Southern Utah, and Northern Colorado have yet to earn a win in conference, sitting at 0-2.
Week 6 has come and gone, and it featured some more blowouts, as 3 of the 4 games were decided by 45 points or more, and in all 4 games, the losing team failed to find the end zone. Before we get into Week 7's action, let's take a look back at the weekend that was. In the conference's first showdown of the season, number 4 Kennesaw State took down Presbyterian 56-0. Reigning Big South Player of the Year, dual-threat quarterback Chandler Burks accounted for 5 of the Owls' touchdowns. Burks ran for 135 yards on 16 carries with 4 touchdowns and added 53 yards in a score through the air. Backup quarterback Tommy Bryant also threw for a touchdown. He completed both of his passes for 56 yards. Kennesaw State ran for 485 yards as a team, while the Blue Hose finished with just 24 yards on 28 carries. Freshman quarterback Jordan Morgan completed 6 of his 7 passes for 129 yards in the loss. Over at Barker Lane Stadium in North Carolina, the Campbell Fighting Camels took down Wagner 49-3. Campbell jumped out to a 21-3 lead after the first and took a 35-3 lead into the break, before rounding out their scoring with a touchdown in the third and the fourth. For the Fighting Camels, dual-threat quarterback Daniel Smith ran for 151 yards and 3 scores on 16 carries. Through the air, Smith completed 5 of his 14 passes for 120 yards and a touchdown. The score going to Aaron Blockman on an 84-yard pitch and catch. Joshua Jones finished with 103 yards on 11 carries on the ground, and defensive back Dorian Jones found the end zone with a 30-yard pick 6 in the win. Gardner Webb traveled to Johnson City to take on East Tennessee State and fell 45-0. The Running Bulldogs trailed just 17-zip at halftime, but 2 scores in both the third and the fourth blew the game open. Gardner Webb surrendered 461 yards of total offense, 217 on the ground, and 244 through the air. Quarterback Jordan Smith completed 17 of his 24 passes for 142 yards and 2 interceptions in the loss. In the conference's closest game of the week, Charleston Southern lost on the road at Savannah State. The Buccaneers trailed 14-0 until the closing seconds of the first half, when Tyler Kekic connected on a 35-yard field goal to put Charleston Southern on the board for the only time in the game. After a scoreless third, the Tigers added their final 9 points thanks to a team safety and a touchdown run in the fourth. Charleston Southern accounted for just 123 total yards of offense in the loss. Before we get into Week 7's action, let's check out the updated Big South standings. Thanks to their 56-0 throttling of Presbyterian, Kennesaw State moved up to number 3 in the Stats FCS Top 25. They sit atop the conference leaderboard at 1-0. Campbell is in second at 5-1 and will get Week 7 off. Coming off their own bye week, Monmouth is in third at 3-2. 1-3 Charleston Southern is in fourth, with 1-5 Gardner Webb sitting in fifth. The Blue Hose round out the standings in the basement at 0-1 in the conference and 2-2 overall. The Presbyterian Blue Hose go back out of conference this weekend to host 2-3 Hampton. The Blue Hose bring in a struggling offense that ranks in the bottom 10 in total yards. Presbyterian is also scoring just under 13 points per game. On the other side of the ball, the Blue Hose defense has been very good at stopping the opponent's air game, as they have allowed just 625 passing yards this season, the 4th fewest in the country. Hampton allows over 33 points per game, so this may be the weekend for the Blue Hose offense to finally break out. Fresh off their bye week, the Monmouth Hawks are set to host 1-5 Bucknell. Both Hawks losses have come on the road, and in their 2 games at home, the Hawks have scored 56 points and 54 points respectively. Monmouth brings in a balanced offense that has scored 32 points per game. They rank in the top 40 in both passing and rushing yards, and they get to verse a Bucknell defense that is allowing over 410 yards per game. That Monmouth offense is led by Kenji Bahar, who leads the conference with 1,333 passing yards. The Charleston Southern Buccaneers will host the Virginia University of Lynchburg of the National Christian College Athletic Association this weekend. The Dragons are 2-3 on the season and have 4 FCS schools on their schedule. The Buccaneers bring in a bottom 10 offense paired with a top 10 defense. The Charleston Southern defense is allowing just over 127 yards per game through the air, the best mark in the FCS. This may be the week for dual-threat quarterback London Johnson and that Buccaneer offense to finally figure things out. And for the 2nd week in a row, Kennesaw State plays in the Big South's only conference game. Now ranked 3rd, they travel to Gardner-Webb to take on the Runnin' Bulldogs. The defending conference champions have won 6 straight Big South contests and got to play a Gardner-Webb team whose only win came against Division II Limestone. The Runnin' Bulldogs have a bottom 30 offense and a bottom 10 defense, while the Owls own a top 25 defense and the 7th best offense in the country. Kennesaw State also brings in the country's 2nd best ground attack that has scored over 46 points per game, the 4th most in the FCS. As for Gardner-Webb, they surrender over 42 points per game. Kennesaw State could be well on their way to their 7th consecutive Big South victory. That's all for this week in the Big South. Come back next week for all the results and more. For the FCS Conference Whiparound, I'm Frank LaSala.
Now that conference play is underway in the Colonial Athletic Association, the standings are beginning to take shape. Elon, URI, Towson, and Maine are 2-0. JMU and Stony Brook are 2-1. Udell and William & Mary are 1-1. Albany, New Hampshire, Villanova, and Richmond are all winless in the division. Now let's take a look at last week's games. New Hampshire blew out Holy Cross 28-0. Neil O'Connor led the way with 108 receiving yards and a touchdown. William & Mary beat Albany 25-22. Devontae Dedman helped lead the Tribe to victory with 138 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. Albany wasted a huge day from running back Elijah Abidakun-Hanks, who had 221 rushing yards. Delaware beat up Richmond 43-28. Blue Hen safety Nasir Adderley led the way for the defense with 2 interceptions. Spider quarterback Joe Mancuso did his best to keep Richmond in the game, throwing for 489 yards and 3 touchdowns. Rhode Island dominated Brown 48-0. Quarterback Vito Priori, who's playing for the injured Jawan Lawson, threw for 310 yards and 4 touchdowns. Towson routed Stony Brook 52-28. Quarterback Tom Flacco had himself a day, throwing for 319 yards and 4 touchdowns. Maine pulled out the defensive struggle against Villanova 13-10. Black Bear kicker Kenny Doak kicked a walk-off 52-yard field goal as the buzzer sounded. Julian Williams dominated defensively for them, intercepting a pass and recovering a fumble. In my CAA game of the week, Elon pulled out the upset, beating James Madison 27-24 in their first win over a top 5 team in program history. Phoenix running back Malcolm Summers ran for 186 yards and a touchdown. Danucci did his best to pull the game out, throwing 316 yards and a touchdown in their loss. Now let's take a look at this week's matchups. Richmond heads to Albany to take on the Great Danes. Stony Brook will look to get back to their winning ways as they head to New Hampshire. William & Mary will look to win back-to-back games as they go to Towson to take on the Tigers and their electric offense. Elon will look to keep it rolling as they head to Delaware to take on Udell. In a game where both teams will look to bounce back, James Madison will head to Villanova. And in my CAA game of the week, Maine and Rhode Island will face off in Rhode Island in a fight between 2 teams nobody expected to be at the top of the conference. Maine's stout black hole defense will look to neutralize the Rams' explosive offense. No matter who is quarterbacking for Rhode Island, their offense is going to put up some points. With your CAA Whiparound, I'm Ryan Griffith. Enjoy the games.
At long last, the Ivy League gets some love from the Stats FCS Top 25 poll as Princeton snuck into the number 25 spot this week. the Tigers may be one of the biggest surprises in all of the FCS, as they now boast the second highest point differential in the league at 179 points plus. Quarterback John Lovett has been nothing short of sensational, as he ranks 3rd in passing yards, 1st in passing touchdowns, 3rd in rushing yards, and 2nd in rushing touchdowns in the Ivy League this season. Let's take a quick look at the conference standings after last week. In a battle for first place, we see Dartmouth edging out Princeton. Though both teams are 4-0 and Princeton has been much more impressive, Dartmouth has one more in-conference win than the Tigers. At the 3 through 5 positions, we see last year's champs Yale, Cornell, and Harvard all fighting for 3rd place, as they have 2-2 overall records and are 1-1 in conference play. At the 6 and 7 slots, we have Penn and Columbia. Both teams have nice records at 3-1, but in each of their losses have come to in-conference opponents. Finally, we have Brown in the 8th and final spot with a disappointing 1-3 record overall and an 0-1 in-conference record. We have an interesting slate of matchups next week, as we will see the Ivy League leader Dartmouth take on Sacred Heart. Princeton will stay at home to take on the last place Brown Bears. Yale will look to bounce back after a crushing loss to Dartmouth last week as they take on Mercer at home. Cornell will try to keep their positive momentum going after their big win over Harvard last week as they make the short trip to visit Colgate this week. Harvard will look to get back on track as they welcome in Holy Cross this weekend. Finally, my game to watch in the Ivy League features 3-1 Penn welcoming the 3-1 Columbia Lions as each team searches for their first in-conference win of the season. That's it for this week in the Ivy League. For Football Game Plan's FCS Whiparound, I'm Ian Gridley, and I'll see you next week.
Week 6 was a telling one in the MEAC as the contenders for the Celebration Bowl have come to the forefront. Florida A&M stayed undefeated in conference play with a 17-0 win over Norfolk State. North Carolina A&T came back nicely with a 34-6 win over Delaware State, while Savannah State earned a nice out-of-conference win over Charleston Southern 23-3. The top performance of the week goes to North Carolina Central quarterback Chauncey Caldwell, who threw for 332 yards and 3 scores while also running for 153 yards and another touchdown, as he led the Eagles to a 40-35 win over Howard. Taking a look at the standings after Week 6, Florida A&M and North Carolina A&T are both undefeated in conference play, with A&M holding the top spot having played one more game. 5 teams, including Bethune-Cookman, Howard, and South Carolina State, sit at 1-1 trying to play catch-up in the second half of the season. In Week 7, the Bears of Morgan State will travel to Savannah State with both teams looking for their second win. South Carolina State will host Bethune-Cookman, while Delaware State will look to ruin homecoming for Howard and get their first win of the season in the process. However, all eyes will turn this week to the Carolinas as 2 undefeated teams in conference will once again square off. Quarterback Ryan Stanley will lead the Rattlers of Florida A&M against Lamar Renard and North Carolina A&T, with the winner being in the driver's seat to go to the Celebration Bowl to represent the MEAC in this week's FCS Stats Game of the Week. For the FCS Conference Whiparound, I'm David Hassagen.
Welcome to Week 7. After a nail-biting Week 6, there are now 4 teams ranked in the top 25. Here are the conference standings. The Bison and Yotes are 2-0. The Redbirds, Jackrabbits, Bears, Panthers, Leathernecks, and Penguin Nation are all 1-1, and the Sycamores and Salukis are 0-2. Looking ahead at Week 7, there are 5 games this week as all teams are in action. Let's start off by heading to Indiana State, where the Sycamores host Missouri State. Both teams' QBs had career days and look to continue to keep that momentum going. The key matchup, though, in the game will be the hard-pounding Bears defense against the Sycamores' phenom running back Jaquan Keys. To Illinois State, where the number 12 Redbirds host Southern Illinois. The Salukis, who averaged 40 points per game, were held to just 14 points last week, but they get their starting quarterback Sam Straub back, who lit up defenses all year. The Redbirds will count on running back James Robinson, coming off of his big performance to grind out the clock and keep the ball out of the Salukis' hands. To South Dakota, where the number 24 Yotes hosts Northern Iowa. The Panthers, who gave the number 1 Bison a scare last week, will look to continue their offensive output behind quarterback Eli Dunn and running back Trevor Allen and Marcus Wehmiller, but it won't be easy as the Yotes defense, led by 2-time consecutive Missouri Valley Football Conference Defensive Player of the Week, Andrew Gray, will have that defense swarming all over the ball, and quarterback Austin Simmons is always a threat with his arm and legs. To South Dakota State, where the number 2 Jackrabbits host Youngstown State. Quarterback Tyron Christian looks to continue to shatter conference and league records as he had 5 more TDs last week, and he and his new favorite target, Cade Johnson, continue to drive defenses insane. And finally, to North Dakota State, where the #1 Bison travel to Western Illinois. Bison QB Easton Stick, who took over the game and sealed the victory last week, and their monster running game will look to continue to lead this unstoppable offense, as the key matchup will be if linebacker Jabril Cox and the Bison defense can stop the Leathernecks offense led by quarterback Sean McGuire, who will be looking for his 3rd 300-yard passing games in 4 weeks. Now to this week's Conference Players of the Week. Offensive honors goes to Indiana State quarterback Ryan Boyle, who had 276 passing yards and 2 passing and 2 rushing touchdowns. Defensive honors for the 2nd week in a row goes to South Dakota free safety Andrew Gray, who forced 2 fumbles and an interception. And special team honors goes to South Dakota State kicker Chase Vinatieri, who had 2 field goals and scored on a 15-yard touchdown on a fake field goal. For the Missouri Valley Football Conference on Football Gameplan's FCS Whiparound, I'm Brian Sullivan.
There's been a lot of parity in the NEC so far this year, but one team has been consistent and constant with their offensive play, and that's the Bryant Bulldogs. Let's see who they play this week and the rest of the schedule in the Northeast Conference.
Bryant welcomes in the Central Connecticut State Blue Devils. St. Francis to trip up to Staten Island to take on the Wagner Seahawks. Sacred Heart has an out-of-conference game against 4-0 Dartmouth. And Robert Morris makes the short trip down to Duquesne to take on the Dukes. Taking a look at the standings, Bryant sits atop the NEC with a 2-0 in-conference record, followed by Sacred Heart and Central Connecticut with 1 win. St. Francis will play their first in-conference game this weekend, while Duquesne and Wagner both have 1 loss in conference, and Robert Morris sitting at 0-2.
In the Ohio Valley Conference, we talk a lot about Jacksonville State, Tennessee State, even Austin Peay, but quietly, the team that has been surprising so far this year are the Murray State Racers, as they find themselves 2-0 in conference play. Now here's a look at the rest of the standings and the schedule for Week 7.
2 teams are undefeated at the top of the OVC right now. Number 8, Jacksonville State with 3 wins and Murray State with 2. Southeast Missouri State, Tennessee State, Eastern Kentucky, and UT Martin all sit at 1-1. Austin Peay and Eastern Illinois both at 1-2, while Tennessee Tech is still searching for their first win. 4 in-conference games this week as Tennessee State travels to Murray State, Austin Peay heads to Southeast Missouri State, Eastern Kentucky travels to UT Martin, and Eastern Illinois will take on the number 8 Gamecocks in Jacksonville.
We know Colgate is one of the best teams in the FCS, but quietly, you look at the 2nd place team and you have the Georgetown Hoyas, undefeated in conference play, coming off of a big win against the Fordham Rams. Let's take a look at the rest of the schedule for this week and the standings in the Patriot League.
Some Friday night football in the Patriot League as Holy Cross travels to Harvard. Number 20 Colgate looks to stay undefeated as they welcome in Cornell. The 0-5 Fordham Rams will travel up to Lehigh. Monmouth will host Bucknell. And Georgetown makes the trip to Pennsylvania to take on the Lafayette Leopards. The number 20 Colgate Raiders sit atop the Patriot League with a perfect 3-0 in-conference record, followed up by Georgetown, also undefeated. Bucknell sitting at 1-1. Lehigh will get their first taste of conference play this weekend. Lafayette, Fordham, and Holy Cross all looking for their first in-conference win.
It's been the Killer D's in the Pioneer Football League this year, with Davidson having an impressive season and the Drake Bulldogs. Whether these teams stand in the Pioneer Football League standings, well, let's take a look at that and also the upcoming schedule for this week.
It's getting a little crowded at the top of the standings in the Pioneer League, with Drake and San Diego both undefeated with 2 wins. Dayton and Davidson right behind them with a record of 2-1 in conference. Stetson, Butler, and Marist all sitting at 1-1, while Jacksonville, Morehead State, and Valparaiso are all 0-2. Might be a tough afternoon for the Morehead State Eagles as they fly into North Carolina to take on the 5-1 Davidson Wildcats. Marist makes the journey from Poughkeepsie down to Jacksonville, and a battle of 3-1 teams as Drake welcomes in Stetson. Butler will travel to the 0-5 Valparaiso Crusaders, and Dayton will make the trip out west to take on the Toreros of San Diego.
There are always some good football being played in the Southern Conference. You talk about a team that's playing some good football this year, the Mercer Bears. They have an interesting game this week as they travel up to New Haven to face the Yale Bulldogs. Let's see who else has a big test this week as we take a look at the schedule and the standings.
Wofford looks to stay perfect in conference as they travel to Furman. Mercer takes the trip up to Connecticut to take on Ivy League foe Yale. The Citadel looks to stay alive as they take on number 23 East Tennessee State. The Keydets of VMI look to get their first win this year as they're going to travel to Stanford. And 4-2 Chattanooga travels to Western Carolina to take on the Catamounts. 23 East Tennessee State and number 6 Wofford, both with a 3-0 record in conference. Mercer and Chattanooga both have 2 wins. Furman, Western Carolina, Sanford, and Citadel only with 1. And VMI down at the bottom with an 0-4 record.
Let's see, in the Southland Conference, you have McNeese State, you also have Sam Houston State, you even have Nichols playing great football, but the team that has been the surprise story and the one that needs to be talked about a little bit more are the Incarnate Word Cardinals. So let's take a look at who they play this week and the standings in the Southland Conference.
Looking at the schedule, number 18 Central Arkansas travels down to Texas to take on Stephen F. Austin. Number 11 Nichols visits Abilene Christian. Battle of the Birds as Incarnate Word goes up against Lamar. Southeast Louisiana hopes that the Huskies don't get their first win in conference as they host Houston Baptist. And the number 15 Sam Houston State Bearcats look to take down the Demons of Northwestern State. The number 9 Cowboys sit alone atop the Southland Conference with a perfect record of 4-0 in conference, followed up by the Cardinals of Incarnate Word, also undefeated with a 3-0 record. Nichols State is in within striking distance at a 3-1 record. Sam Houston State and Central Arkansas both at 2-1, while Southeastern Louisiana sit 2-2. Northwestern State, Stephen F. Austin, and Abilene Christian all look to keep pace to get their second win within the conference this weekend, while Lamar and Houston Baptist still need to put up a W in conference play.
Week 6 in the SWAC was filled with competitive matchups. Alabama State edged out Alcorn State on the road, winning 28-25 after 5 overtimes. Jackson State had a come-from-behind victory, beating Arkansas Pine Bluff 30-27. The Delta Devils remain winless on the season after falling to Bethune-Cookman 41-27. Grambling made easy work out of Panhandle, winning that contest 62-7. And Alabama A&M was victorious on the road, beating Texas Southern 42-21. Taking a look at the standings, in the East, Alcorn State and Alabama A&M are tied for first, both with a 2-1 conference record, with Jackson State and Alabama State trailing by 1 conference game each. Over in the West, Prairie View A&M sits atop the division with a 2-0 conference record. Grambling and Southern are each 1 game behind for the lead in the West. Week 7 in the SWAC has 5 games on the slate. Alcorn State takes on Alabama A&M. Jackson State hosts the winless Delta Devils. Alabama State travels to South Alabama to take on the Jaguars. Southern U is looking for a big win going up against Prairie View A&M. And Grambling goes on the road to face off against Texas Southern. For the FCS Conference Whiparound, I'm Max Bazzone.